Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the 9th lecture in our series on the Introduction to Family and Kinship in India. In today's lecture, we are going to look at a specific idea within kinship which is emerging as transnational economies of care and trade overcome people and their ways of domestic living. Today's focus is on care and kinship. Ideally, the notion of care is discussed as a separate idea within itself. Care economies are emerging as important nodes of looking at transnational families and how they negotiate spaces and time. Care economies actually begins with the sociologist Arlie Hochschild's idea of emotional labor. Hochschild speaks of how labor can be particularly emotive and important when it is rendered in its emotional state. Her study of air hostesses in American Airlines becomes an important tool to look at how new economies work not only through manual or physical labor, but also through the idea of how people link up and think through their relationships. Thus, in her book, The Managed Heart, Hochschild speaks of air hostesses and their constant work to keep their customers happy. The act of smiling and catering to customers' needs and desires while travel is also a form of labor that is not given its particular due. According to Arlie Hochschild, the idea of emotional labor is even more difficult when seen in terms of the kind of expenditure and time that people invest in it. Thus, to be constantly happy and invested in your customers takes an emotional toll on those who perform emotional labor. Taking this idea forward, care becomes a very important node to look at kinship as well. Lawrence Cohen's book on aging in India actually looks at the idea of how intergenerational care impacts our own notions of age and aging. Old age in India is particularly marked as the economy modernizes and globalizes. In one of our lectures, we discussed extensively the idea of the joint family in India. One of the notions that surrounds the idea of the joint family in India was the idea that old age and aged relatives are taken care of even as the family expands. As we disintegrate supposedly into notions of nuclear households, families become more and more bereft and unable to take care of their elderly and aging parents. The intergenerational contract has now broken to a large extent. As children move out of homes and make their own families away from countries of residence and of their parental generation, many elderly parents are left behind to fend for themselves. Such a notion becomes critical in understanding how modernization, globalization, and urbanization impacts the way we think of our families and intimate relationships. Sarah Lamb's interesting work on positive aging in America and India looks at how American elderly are now fast positioning themselves as fit and in the terrain of longevity. This means that many of them are denying aging. This is contrary to what Lamb finds in case of Indian aging elderly. She thinks the Indian elderly encompass and think of their lives as coming to an end. They embrace death the way it should be embraced as part of the end of an entire life cycle. The denial of death, which marks Western civilization and the move towards a positive aging movement, is now slowly creeping into Indian urban city living as well. Thus, the Indian aged living in urban cities who are now living by themselves are also seeking a different kind of life where they aim to take care of themselves as they increasingly grow old. Thus, the dependence on close kin has become an idea which is slowly becoming minimal in its orientation and scope. Within such an idea, Lawrence Cohen discusses the influence of the bad family in creating ideas of senility and Alzheimer's amongst the elderly in India. For Cohen, as the elderly become old, bereft, and more disabled, the blame on their aging and impact on the aging comes onto the family itself and to the idea of the intergenerational tie which is unable to take care of them. The bad family is marked by immediate kin who are unable to fulfill the duties that are marked out for family members as their elderly parents age and become slowly and come closer to death. This notion therefore of aged care marks our idea of the family itself. The intergenerational transfer of knowledge and money is also to be reciprocated through the younger generation promising care for their elderly relatives. When such a contract is broken, as is being increasingly seen, where the younger generation is moving away and unable to take care of the elderly or unwilling to do so, what happens to the idea of the care itself? Most importantly, what happens to the idea of kinship too? Within the scope of our lecture today, I want to discuss how care is also particularly marked in looking at kinship beyond just the intergenerational tie and that of blood relations. Here I am particularly interested in looking at how care may be marked on certain roles that people outside our immediate kith and kin fulfill, which is closer to what kin do for each other. Here I am particularly interested in the idea of domestic servants and how domestic labor and domestic work within the household has important implications to look through care and kinship. Here care is particularly important in the way in which we think about how and who helps us out within the household in taking care of our children and our daily activities. In that sense, care and kinship also works through the terrains of everyday kinship. It is particularly important and emotive to look at these relations which we do not immediately assign the qualifiers of kin and family. Extending Ali Hoshal's work of emotional labor, she uses the categorization of labor through its affective turn in looking at roles such as that of the mother and of the surrogate. Beyond the air hostess are a multitude of roles that especially women fulfill in looking at kin and others in their most delicate state. Hospital nurses provide particular kind of emotional labor which is very difficult. So do midwives and other professionals who help women in birthing. But most importantly, mothers fulfill the biggest emotional labor that they take on, which we do not identify as labor because mothers fulfill it through the entire idea of sacrifice. In looking at mothering and the idea of emotional labor, the Filipina sociologist Rosel Parenas speaks of very diverse ideas. In her very influential text on mothering from a distance, Rosel Parenas looks at Filipina women who migrate to countries other than the Philippines to work as domestic labor. Her work is particularly potent in understanding how kinship becomes fraught when a key member of the family has to fulfill her role of emotional and affective labor outside of the household. Here, interestingly, whatever we have discussed about the family and the household comes together again in a fissured, disputed sense. The conflict of mothering becomes acute when the mother herself is not present in the act of mothering. In Rosel Parenas' work, therefore, she looks at how the social reproduction of the transnational family is an acute moment of the globalized turn in care economies. Her work looks at Filipina women who have migrated to the US and parts of Europe such as Italy to help other Italian and American women take care of their young children. Here the economy of care and work becomes intermingled in looking at how women support each other across borders and boundaries in taking care of children. We must remember that within such an economy, men also play a very important emotive part. But before we go into that, a brief about how Parenas conceptualizes mothering from a distance. In her idea of transnational nanny work that Filipino women undertake in their travel to other countries away from the Philippines, Parenas notes that women actually are unable to participate in the domestic economies of the countries where they work by bringing their children with them. Many countries where these women work, such as the UAE or parts of Europe, expressly forbid Filipino women from bringing their children or families with them to the countries where they work. This also has a lot to do with the politics of immigration and control of citizenship and refugees. However, the most important element here that Parenas notes is that these countries seek the production and labor of these women but are unwilling to engage with them at the level of reproducing their own. Thus, many of these women who go to work as domestic helps, maids and other service sector employees in countries other than their own home countries are not allowed to cohabit with local men or marry them. These are particular rules that countries follow to limit immigration of particular sets of people, especially from the global south. Within such a situation, Parenas finds that 3 sets and 3 tiers of commodification of women's labor and care work happens. The first is that between middle class women in the US and Italy who hire Filipino women to take care of their children. These women hire Filipino women so that they can themselves contribute to their own domestic economy in terms of the work that they undertake. This is particularly important when thinking of how Filipino women contribute to respective recipient country economies and their sense of economic growth. The second tier is that of the migrant Filipina domestic worker herself, who travels from the Philippines to the other country to take care of the children of the resident women who are working in their own domestic economies. The third tier is that of the local Filipino women who, due to a paucity of income or money, is unable to travel abroad and therefore is left to take care of those women who have already left and their children. Thus, interestingly, Filipino migrant workers who work abroad hire local Filipino women to take care of their own children, care itself. Most importantly, what happens to the idea of kinship too. Within the scope of our lecture today, I want to discuss how care is also particularly marked in looking at kinship beyond just the intergenerational tie and that of blood relations. Here I am particularly interested in looking at how care may be marked on certain roles that people outside our immediate kith and kin fulfill, which is closer to what kin do for each other, of women oppresses another set. Filipino women fall under category of the oppressed, but they also follow through with further inequality by hiring local Filipino women in cycles of inequality and stratified reproduction. For Parenas, the aspect of mothering from a distance is very acute when seen in terms of how care works through and how kinship becomes a potent idea here. Thus, amongst Filipino migrants, mothering from a distance usually follows ideas of extreme guilt and unhappiness. They are depressed about leaving their families and young children behind in the Philippines to go work abroad. The contingencies of economy and of poverty mean that many Filipino women have to make this hard choice and leave their children behind. The leaving of the children behind has to follow with deeper emotional conflict and unhappiness. Thus, depression and guilt are common elements of how Filipino migrants actually navigate their time abroad, taking care of other people's children. Thus, the taking care of other people's children also becomes an emotive and difficult situation for many of these Filipino women. They see their own children being neglected back home and feel their loss as they care for other people's children. This form of bound conflict in their emotional space creates further stress and anxiety for these women. Most importantly, Filipino women negotiate their feelings in 3 very important ways. The first is the commodification of love. Most of these Filipino women buy expensive gifts to send back home to make their children happy and overcome their sense of guilt at missing out on their upbringing and socialization. This form of expensive gift giving becomes an important trope for these women to handle their own feelings of inadequacy as they stay away from their families. The second feeling that Filipino women channelize in order to get over their guilt is that of the repression of their emotional state. The more they repress, the more they are able to work better. This is an important element of the care economy that Hochschild has already identified. Even though you may be going through a very, very bad day, as part of the emotional labor economy, you must put up a brave face and smile all the time. This takes an immense toll on your personal health, personal and mental health. In the same sense, Filipina migrant workers who care for children in US and Italy also mask their deep unhappiness through a forced sense of happiness and fulfillment. The desire to constantly stay in touch with their family and go back home is masked through everyday care of other people's children. Thus, the third feeling of the rationalization of distance is undertaken through measured calls and communications with children back home in the Philippines. These calls are always monitored by employees, and often Filipina women themselves take care to not talk incessantly or for too long. The idea is to keep the distance intact so the children may grow up healthy and without the feeling of loss of their own mothers back home. Through the navigation of these different means of thinking through, Filipina women overcome some part of their guilt at transnational mothering. However, it never really goes away. This aggravated pain of separation which they carry is also then reflected in the children who stay back. The children themselves, according to Parenas, have their own emotional longing for their mother, which they express in three very important ways. The first refers to how the commodities and gifts that mothers sent out of love from abroad are not taken seriously by the children. The children who are left behind in Philippines believe that these gifts are not adequate enough or do not truly represent their mother's love. The physical presence of their mother is an important thing that the children crave for while living in Philippines. They do realize that gift giving is one way to overcome the loss that the mothers feel for their children's presence, but the children are unable to compensate for that through the acceptance of the gift. Thus, the commodification of love never really makes an impact on the children who are left behind. Similarly, these children believe that while their mothers are abroad, the whole idea of working to support the family cannot be justified enough. They believe that their mothers could have worked at home as well. They understand their mother's sacrifice, but not to the extent at which their mothers continue to work away from them and do not participate in their upbringing. In that sense, the children do not understand or recognize their mother's sacrifice in the way that they should be doing. This conflicted emotion between what the mothers are going through and what their children feel back home becomes even more acute as gender roles become reversed in the Filipina household economy. Thus, as per state rhetoric and social understanding, mothers and fathers continue to be constructed as per traditional gender roles, where the father is the breadwinner and the mother is the one who takes care of children at home. As soon as the globalized economy reverses such a role, children are unable to understand the loss of the sexual division of labor that the mother was supposed to fulfill. Here, fathers, grandmothers, and other kin step in to take care of the child, but the child is unable to accept it as he or she is already socialized into traditional gender norms where mothers stay at home and fathers go out. This becomes even more acute as children do not understand the role that their fathers play in taking care of them and the role that their mothers play in supporting them financially from a distance. Parenas mentions two examples where a young woman in her 20s still suffers from deep anger against her mother's absence through her childhood and upbringing while she worked abroad. At the same time, another child, a young boy in his late teens, is completely reconciled with the absence of his father, as his father worked abroad and his mother stayed at home. The son shows genuine affection for his father's sacrifice at not being at home, while the young woman whose mother worked abroad continues to be marked in the young girl's mind as someone who reneged on her duty and authority, on her homely duties. I apologize. Thus, the denial of maternal love becomes a form of abuse within Filipina local culture and the ways in which it is constructed amongst children and larger society. And even though these women continue to contribute to the economy in a very important way, the construction of their role remains embedded within traditional understandings of motherhood and mothering. Such a notion of care and kinship becomes essential to understanding how we think about kinship, not only through categories of understanding of marriage and blood, but through the most important criteria of all, that of emotional trade and care. Care has within it the element of emotion and affect deeply embedded in how we think of ourselves and our close kin. Thus, in two very interesting studies undertaken in India, I look at how the notion of care comes to mark out those we do not think of as kin. In Simin Qayyum and Raka Ray's study of domestic labor in Calcutta, they speak of the ways in which the domestic servant becomes a part of both the family and is at the same time outside it. Linked through studies of colonial Calcutta households with modern Calcutta residences, the authors see how servants continue to be part of a kinship framework that is marked through care, but are also excluded through acts of class and caste distinction. An important part of their work is embedded in Perenna's theoretical conceptualization, where they look at how migrant workers contribute to recipient economies, and at the same time how recipient countries who hire migrant labor are dependent on their labor to take care of their future children and future members of the community. Thus, in Qayyum and Ray's study, there are primarily two sets of employers. One set of employers in Calcutta belongs to the upper middle class and the upper class elite, who have traditionally had servants in their home, who have had multiple servants in their home, and who have always been there for generations, showcasing loyalty to the employer. This set of employer is known as the Bhadralok, or those who are the educated and the intellectual elite, and who have had a distinct role in marking the political and collective conscience of Calcutta and of India. The second set of employers are young professionals who are in their early 30s and early 40s, who work in the global economy and position themselves within an economy that is both transnational and global, thanks to their travels abroad. These two employers hire different types of servants, and it is in the construction of the difference that the real sense of kinship and care comes through. The first set of employers have always depended on a retinue of servants drawn from the rural poor of Bengal. Their primary dependence on servants is linked to huge homesteads or bungalows and mansions that they needed taking care of. Here, servants were never less than 3 or 4 and occupied the space of the homestead in a very active way, living in the same space as their employers. The second set of new professionals, however, live in smaller spaces such as high-rise apartments and hire servants who can come and go without taking up place in these apartments. The most important aspect here is the lived space and its intimacy, which only a few people can penetrate. The penetration of the intimate sphere of the home therefore has to be regulated through particular people and particular servants. In that sense, Qayyum and Ray identify 4 different types of servants from their study. The first is the oldest and the finest of servants who have stayed back as family retainers through several generations in loyalty to one particular family. The second set of servants consists of live-in full-time servants who live and work in the houses of their employers, but not for many generations. The third set of servants are those who live out but are full-time servants going back at the end of the day, back to their homes, and who live and work for one employer every day, all day. The fourth set of servants have become the more popular and common form in Calcutta today, consisting of part-time workers who work in several homes every day, fulfilling certain sets of chores such as sweeping, swabbing, cleaning, or cooking. Such servants move fluidly between homes and at the end of the day go back to their own respective homes. Such contractual domestic labor is characteristic of being primarily and mostly female. Within such a categorization of domestic labor in Calcutta city, Qayyum and Ray find that servants navigate different ideas of care itself with their employers. In interviews with employers and servants alike, the ethnographers find that the idea of the old servant continues to mark notions of how care should be handed out. The earlier full-time retainer remains romanticized in the memories of many of the upper-class Calcutta residents who believe that the loyal servant who stayed with them through generations of living actually was the best form of servant, who continues to be a part of their family. Such loyalty merits family membership but does not merit adequate payment and resources for the servant. Qayyum and Ray are particularly interested in looking at how the economy works through the generation of kinship ties with old retainers who refuse to leave their employer's home, continuing to stay there. They are especially marked by an old poem by the poet Rabindranath Tagore, where he describes the stay and final death of an old servant in his employer's home out of complete loyalty for his services. In the end, the servant gets neither money nor inheritance, but is left to die in his own devices. Such a pathetic existence marks and wins the upper class's loyalty in terms of extending kinship and kin-based links to such people. In interviews with other full-time servants, the ethnographers find that most servants think that their employers are good as long as they obey their directions. Kinship here becomes marked with a sense of paternalistic relationship. Thus, most servants think of their employers as parents who, when they scold them, must be heard and understood. In that sense, Qayyum and Ray are particularly invested in looking at the idea of the cultures of servitude that emerge from such economies of care. Such a culture of servitude therefore depends on the constant loyalty of certain servants and their minimal wages that they get. It's an unequal economy which is also sharply divided on class and caste lines. Thus, in many Indian households, the servant occupies a separate space, a space which is inferior to the larger space where the family lives. They also have separate utensils from which they eat and drink, marking the class and caste distinction very clearly. In such a situation, the emergence of contractual labor through part-time paid work actually threatens the culture of servitude that has existed for so long in Calcutta domestic economy. Thus, female servants who come and go and are part of several households position themselves in a moment where the employer is unable to order them around. It also means that the old idea of the personal retainer is on its way out. In many senses, Qayyum and Ray discuss the way in which the premises that shape the discourse on domestic servitude are very, very important. Here they identify three particular modes of how households are run in Calcutta. The ideology that marks the cultures of servitude include, firstly, that servants are essential for a well-run household. Secondly, that servants are part of the family and bond through it by ties of affection and loyalty. If the servant remains loyal to the household, he will receive the affection of the family in return. Finally, servants belong to a different class along with their own set of lifestyle, eating habits, and ways of being. This means that the points of conflict are reduced to a minimum within the household, where the servant has to primarily follow the diktats of the owners of the home. This also means that care and kinship become part of such a servitudinal economy, and the culture of servitude a part of an ideology where the servant occupies an unequal relationship through the resurrection of kinship ties. If you remember from our lecture yesterday, Geert de Neve's article speaks of factory workers in Tamil Nadu who are often linked to the employer through fictive kin ties so that they may owe loyalty to the factory owner. It's a similar sense of ideology that is used by employers to create unequal notions of bonding and loyalty, wherein they continue to use cheaper labor at lower cost to themselves. Some of the points of conflict that Qayyum and Ray identify in the Calcutta domestic household economy are as follows. The first, the visibility of the current part-time servant clashes with the invisibility of the earlier full-time retainer. This is particularly important as within smaller spaces of the apartment building, the part-time servant comes and goes and inhabits spaces while she works. She is visible to the occupants and is also visible in the way she acts out and stays within the space. This is oppositional to the old-time servant who worked for large families in big homes or estates and was largely invisible, appearing only when required. The invisibility of the servant and the way in which he or she works smoothly through the household chores also marked his or her presence in the care economy. The invisibility of the servant made him more family than ever before. If you do not see your personal retainer often, he becomes even better to work with. Earlier mansions and old homes afforded that form of invisibility, but modern part-time contractual labor in apartment buildings has done away with it. The visibility that the part-time servant offers is also problematic for the employers, who do not wish to see the class and caste distinction that they operate with in terms of their domestic servants. The second point of conflict is the conceptualization of what Qayyum and Ray call the rhetoric of love. The rhetoric of love is a very potent idea that employers use with reference to their full-time retainers in calling them part of their family and seeking and demanding loyalty from them. The rhetoric of love believes that employers ultimately link their long-time servants in ties of kinship, but also demand that they be constantly loyal and at their beck and call. Such a love is marked by inequality as well. It demands and gives little. The demands are massive and the obligation to return are very, very little. Thus, full-time retainers may continue to work for families for generations but may get little or nothing in return. A very well-known novel by the Bengali novelist Mahashweta Devi remembers the role of wet nurses in traditional zamindari households in Bengal. In a particular story, she refers to the character to a particularly poor Brahmin woman who offers her breast to every generation of children born in a zamindar family, ultimately contracting breast cancer, and who is then abandoned by the very family she fed, ignoring her own children. This also links to Parena's idea of mothering from a distance, invoking ideas of conflict and contradiction where family members are unable to reconcile the need for the care that the care provider gives and how to extend it to his or her family. The rhetoric of love, therefore, is an ideology which is used to exploit domestic labor. In that sense here, the rhetoric of love works on what I have mentioned before is a paternalistic idiom of love and affection that is given freely to the servant in exchange for lifelong loyalty. In that sense, the rhetoric of love has patriarchal overtones. It invests in the patriarchal family and depends on men and their use of domestic labor as and when required. The contemporary working of the rhetoric of love, however, is faced with deep conflicts and unabiding problems. Contractual part-time workers are unable to fulfill the demands of loyalty because they constantly travel between households. In that sense, they remain incomplete and are unable to give loyalty to anyone. Thus, a common refrain in Qayyum and Ray's work refers to how contemporary families now complain of how contractual labor is unable to reciprocate their affection by giving them complete loyalty. Accusations of stealing or not completely doing the work they are supposed to do become an oft repeated narrative within domestic labor. In that sense, the rhetoric of love does not work within part-time labor. Here, affection given by the lady of the house to the female employer may be couched in terms of a sense of maternalistic affection, but does not fulfill the requirements of the same. Thus, the meaning of love and obligation that the rhetoric of love embodies becomes deeply problematic in looking at how contractual work comes to embody care and kinship. The contract in its essential nature means an exchange of money and services between two equal members. In that sense, inequality and affection does not work in the way in which employers would expect it to work. But contractual labor is largely beneficial for those who occupy the domestic labor market because they are able to call the shots on their own terms. Having said that, Qayyum and Ray are very clear that contractual labor is also exploitative in the sense of the way in which households treat flitting maids and those who occupy spaces of completing chores at a part-time level. Thus, the contract, as mentioned earlier, occupies a position which is in opposition to the idea of love and familial kin. Recalling Viviana Zelazar's idea of hostile worlds, the contract is never between kin but two strangers who occupy equal positions. And in that sense, the idea of kinship can never really blend in with that of the contract. The complaint that most householders in Calcutta now have is in the sense of the contract becoming the overwhelming idea of care and kinship as opposed to the earlier model of the full-time retainer who worked through loyalty and obligation to the employer and created a sense of the rhetoric of love. The care economy in itself marks out kinship in particular ways. In that sense, love, affection and emotion are very, very critical to understanding how we can think of those who do not occupy immediate spaces of kinship and kinning. In Sarah Dickey's influential work on kinship in Tamil Nadu in the city of Mysore, she finds that servants occupy a liminal space which is both dangerous and problematic. Her work is equally important in looking at how, in our sense, the sense in which we occupy our homes are both permeable and fluid. This permeability is particularly transgressive for those who are in our service or occupy the service economy. Thus, in that sense, care work can also upset traditional hierarchies of caste, class and the outside and the inside by providing newer meanings to think about kin and kinship. In Sarah Dickey's work, the permeability of the domestic sphere threatens the home and the intimate, especially through the entry of the domestic servant. Dickey is particularly interested in looking at the ways in which the outside and the inside become conflictual spaces when seen through the eyes of the employers of domestic servants, usually women of the home. In that sense, Dickey is very clear in how she thinks, how Indians think of the outside and the inside. In Mysore, the inside or the Ullai is in opposition to the outside or the Veliyai. And they are positioned in oppositions just like the family, not family, the like, the different and the close and the distant are marked through their opposition. Thus, the inside and the outside becomes very important to look at how relationships are constructed and marked. The inside is that of the family, the home and the close kin, and the outside is the public space with outsiders who are distant from the close kin. The home becomes the center of the inside, marked by the idea of the household, of the hearth and of the people linked through the hearth. Interestingly, the domestic servant is the most important person who crosses this divide into the inside and into the hearth. It marks the servant's engagement with the family and its kith and kin. The transgressive nature of the domestic servant's crossing of borders means that the inside-outside distinction is not as strict as it is meant to be. It is fluid and, as Dickey continues to say, permeable or porous. In such senses, the perimeters of the outside and the inside are constantly fluid and shifting. We are now in a position to look at the public and private space, which can be mixed and combined as per the requirements of the social kin group or the individual. In South India, where Dickey studies domestic servants, she finds that the household is very flexible in terms of thinking through these outside-inside categories. Thus, in her interviews with women or households, employers who occupy the household, she finds that the domestic servant is primarily identified through three important indices: her cleanliness, her permeability into the home, and the fact that she does not interfere in household affairs. Her quality of work, according to Dickey, does not impact the way the domestic servant is imagined in the Tamil household. This is particularly important in thinking of how the servant must fulfill certain important criteria to be able to enter the sacrosanct space of the intimate kin household. Therefore, vices such as thieving or stealing are similar to the other important vice such as gossip. Dickey finds that the act of gossiping becomes very, very important in delineating how they want to think about kin and kinship with reference to care provided by the domestic servant. Thus, the common complaint for firing domestic servants is that of stealing and of gossiping, of transferring information that is intimate and private to the family to other people in the neighborhood or extended kin. Because of the transgressive nature that the domestic servant inhabits, such transference of information is easy, just as stealing items of household importance are easy. This becomes another node by which kinship is destabilized. If we begin to think of transgressive people who are not part of the intimate kin but enter within its fold, kinship itself is not as strong as it should have been. Thus, the servant is imagined within the Tamil household as someone who is inherently class and caste different with embodiments of dirtiness or uncleanliness. The predominance given to the cleanliness of the domestic servant means that traditional ideas of lower caste unhygienic uncleanliness mark the way in which upper caste employers think of their domestic servants. The desire for keeping out the dirt and the not clean from the cleanliness and purity of the hearth becomes ever more important in the employment of domestic servants. The transgressive nature of the domestic servant also means that she is a threat to the intimate space of the home in terms of sexual transgression. Dickey finds that though sexual transgression is never spoken of openly, it nevertheless marks open conversations between employers and their servants. She finds that the bedroom in most homes is closed off to the servant in protection of not only the items of importance that stay in the bedroom, but also in protection of the relationships that the bedroom imagines or protects. The inherent fear of sexual relations between the employer and the maid are also representative of the fear that the outsider can enter and upturn the inside hierarchy or clean relationship between the wife and the husband. Such fears of transgression become important nodes to think of how kinship is never stable, but always under threat and conflict. In many ways, the care economy marks out ideas of kinship not in positive terms, but in negative ideologies of outsider-insider. Here again, the opposition of the outsider and insider is not as acute as it seems. The outsider-insider is constantly marking their space through complete conflict and opposition. At one point, the insider can be the outsider as much as the outsider can be the insider. Such a paradox marks the making of care economies and the extension of care relationships. In this discussion of the domestic servant and the care economy, both in Calcutta and Mysore, the domestic servant is an important part of looking through the care economy. The domestic servant is both transgressive and can become kin and not kin at the same time. The potential to become kin in many ways marks out their relationship with their employers. It is important to note that kinship does not exist in itself, but is also influenced by other economic, social and political ramifications. In our earlier lectures, we thought of kinship as something that exists literally in itself, or as it was called, sui generis. Earlier studies of kinship mentioned that kinship impacted other domains of social life and society, but was all encompassing. As we go towards a newer economy and a global sense of living and seeing things together, kinship becomes something that is marked by other aspects as well. Thus, caste, class, gender and other forms of engagement mark kinship in particular ways. This is important for us to know to conceptualize kinship not only in positive terms but in its negativity. In an important article, Michael Pellet speaks of the ambivalence that marks kinship. This ambivalence can be seen in terms of how we never truly love or hate our relatives, and we never truly love or hate those who are not our relatives. Thus, the conceptualization of the relative itself is always open to scrutiny and fluidity. The domestic servant in the care economy occupies this very important and intimate space. Whether we like it or not, the domestic servant does enter our intimate spaces and does offer help and support in ways in which others do not. But the intermingling of commerce with service and support marks it as a non-kin relationship. Returning to Viviana Zelizer's conceptualization of hostile worlds, this means that we have to constantly think of and reorient ourselves in important ways to look at how kinship and kin making can include elements of economics and finance. It is not enough to think of commercialization and commoditization only in particular spheres, but to look at how our intimate relations can be marked by the same. Thus, the rhetoric of love in Qayyum and Rakare's analysis brings in the element of how love can be commoditized, just like Parena's mothering from a distance. Money economies are a very important part of how intergenerational contracts work as well. Thus, aging parents whose children are not available for actual hands-on care give money to others, such as domestic servants, to take care of their parents. Such ideas of giving and exchanging and giving and receiving become an important part of how we think of kin and kinship. Moving beyond gift economies, therefore, we need to think of gifts themselves as acts of economic exchange. In this sense, economics, money and transactions must identify how we are able to extend our boundaries of kin and kinship. For the moment we are able to identify such dynamism in kinship relations, we can also bring in larger questions of how kinship becomes marked and fraught with ambivalence or ambiguous feelings. Michael Pellet's idea of ambivalence in kinship has become a popular node to look at how kin think of those who are others and those who are own. The othering of those who may be own is also an important part of how kinship thinks through its boundaries and borders. Thus, Sarah Dickey's idea of the permeability of the household is also a larger notion of how kinship can be permeable and porous, and how the fixity of boundaries and borders of who form one's own kin is constantly open to scrutiny and fluidity. We need to think of how care economies, through the care of aging parents or through the service of particular retainers, whether servants or the others who perform services in the service economy, becomes an important way to think of kinship. The family, therefore, is not stuck within the nuclear and joint framework of generational cohabitance or commensality, but includes many more people that we may not want to include. In such a sense, we need to think of how people include and exclude people from their closer group depending on what serves their notion of kinship best. This means that the impact of temporality and life process becomes an essential category to think of those who are included and excluded from close kin groups. Over time, nobody stays constant within this grouping. People constantly change allegiance and affinity and always make new friends or discard old friends. This form of idea means that fictive kinship again and again is being questioned for its fictionalization. We are again looking at how those we exclude and those we include are important markers of thinking about intimacy and intimate kin. We need to also consider how we will be able to think through these categories as time goes by. In essence, the study of care and kinship is important in many ways to look at what we have been studying till now within kinship. Thus, the idea of care itself is very important in navigating models and diagrams which have till now made us think of kinship as a structural entity with no sense of lived reality. Care itself marks out and is essentially identified by the idea of emotion and affect. Here, gender has a very important role to play. All this while, we have been speaking of kinship through the male ego, rarely going into the idea of how kinship itself may be sexualized and gendered. The seminal work by Sylvia Yanagisako and Jane Collier marks the first intervention in looking at kinship through a gendered lens. Kinship, in the way in which it was imagined classical literature, continues to be a male behemoth. In that sense, moving away from a masculine script that marks kinship also means looking at different forms of kinning and kinship. Women become an important part of this process as they think of care through the ties of emotion and affect. Excluding emotion and affect from a consideration of models and ways of being is important for us to manage newer engagements with kinship. Ambivalence, as discussed by Michael Pellets, therefore includes this notion of emotion and affect which comes into being. In stark contrast to the ways in which models exclude that element, newer studies, especially within care and kinship, continue to resurrect the importance of emotionality. How we think of our kin, how we desire our kin, and how we love or do not love them is an essential categorization of how we make our families. Thus, to mark and study love and affection requires particular engagements as well. As we go further into the study of kinship and family, we will see how affection, love, and animosity become important nodes to think about kin, family, and our idea of relatives. Thank you and see you soon.